Welcome to the debate.
It's good to be here.
Today we are really dissecting one of the most paralyzed dynamics in modern healthcare. We're looking at the double bind the telemetry technicians, nurses, and really all bedside staff face. I mean, it is a high-stakes dilemma where acting too slowly can lead to patient death and immediate legal termination, but acting too quickly or, out of turn according to the hierarchy can lead to workplace retaliation, even ridicule.
It's the classic damned if you do, dead if you don't scenario. So we're asking, how do we reconcile the official mandate to, escalate every single alarm with the informal, often brutal hospital culture that discourages crying wolf?
This episode is brought to you by Whole Life Healthcare. And before we dive in, I want to position us clearly. I'm arguing today that policy and patient safety protocols have to be absolute. The fear of social awkwardness or a grumpy resident, well, it's secondary to the catastrophic cost of silence. My stance is simple. If there's harm and you didn't call, you will be in the incident report. Clinicians never get in trouble for calling too early, only too late.
And I respectfully think that's a sentiment that belongs in a textbook, not on a hospital floor at 3 in the morning. I represent the position that workplace hierarchy and a blame culture create these structural barriers to speaking up. Some providers absolutely retaliate when you escalate unnecessarily. So unless you have psychological safety and official empowerment, those safety policies are, well, they're just paper tigers.
Okay, let's put that to the test. I want to start with the cost of silence. Because we have a tendency to talk about culture in the abstract, but the consequences of inaction are, well, they're concrete. I want to bring up the investigation by the California Department of Public Health regarding Vibra Hospital. This is a case that should keep every telemetry tech and nurse awake at night.
It's a harrowing report. I read through that timeline, and it's difficult to stomach.
It is. We're talking about patient 1, a ventilator circuit disconnected at 3:30 a.m. Now, we aren't talking about some subtle deterioration here, where the heart rate drifted up slowly. The ventilator alarm sounded. It sounded for 12 minutes. The Oxynet system, the hospital's paging system, sent multiple pages to the respiratory therapist and the licensed vocational nurse.
And the response?
Silence. No one responded. By the time they entered the room, the patient was cyanotic and unresponsive. They suffered an anoxic brain injury and died 28 days later. But here's the crux of my argument regarding blame. The staff members, the RN, the LVN, the RT, were terminated. The chief clinical officer had to report them to their respective licensing authorities. This proves that the system punishes silence and inaction with the ultimate penalty. You lose your job, you lose your license, and a patient loses their life. If you are unsure, you must call. The blame for calling too early is a bruised ego. The blame for calling too late is a subpoena.
I don't dispute the tragedy at Vibra. It was a catastrophic failure of response. But you're treating the symptom, not the disease. You look at that report and you see negligent individuals. I look at reports like that and I see a broken system that conditioned people to ignore alarms.
How can you condition someone to ignore a ventilator disconnect? That is life support.
You condition them by creating an environment where alarms are constant, and the penalty for a false alarm is humiliation. But let's look at a different environment to understand the mechanism. Let's look at the Nashville VA Medical Center report from the Office of Inspector General. This documents exactly why staff end up in these double binds.
This was the report concerning the rapid response teams?
Correct. The policy at the Nashville VA was explicit. Only the bedside nurse or the charge nurse was authorized to initiate a rapid response team, an ROT call. That was the rule. It was a strict chain of command.
Which makes sense on paper. I mean, you want the person with the most clinical context, the bedside nurse, making the decision.
It makes sense on paper, but it failed completely in practice. The OIG found that telemetry technicians were initiating calls anyway. And why? Because they couldn't find the nurses, or the nurses were just too busy with other high-acuity patients. So these techs were operating in a kind of a shadow system. If they followed the strict chain of command policy, patients would just sit there, deteriorating while the tech hunted for a nurse. If they acted and called the RRT themselves, they were technically breaking protocol.
But they were acting in the interest of patient safety?
They were, but they were vulnerable. And this creates a culture of fear where techs are blamed for overstepping if the patient turns out to be fine because they broke the chain of command, but they would be blamed for inaction if the patient crashed. You say clinicians don't get in trouble for calling early, But in a rigid hierarchy like the Nashville VA described, calling out of turn is absolutely punishable by the culture, if not the policy. Techs face backlash for overreacting, which discourages speaking up the next time.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on that Nashville VA situation. The fact that the techs were calling the RRT despite the policy, it actually proves my point about redundancy. When one layer fails, the nurse availability, another layer acts. The system worked because individuals took responsibility.
Not a sustainable safety model.
But it leads us to the psychology of this failure to rescue. We have to look at the Cornerstone and Odell et al. Research on the effects of rapid response teams. The literature suggests that failure to rescue is often actually failure to recognize or failure to report. The solution isn't to complain about the culture, it's rigorous adherence to vital sign tracking. If you follow the data, you don't have to worry about the hierarchy. The data is the shield.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that it's purely about data tracking. You cited Odell. That same research explicitly mentions why nurses and techs don't call. It's not because they can't read a monitor. It's not because they don't see the numbers dropping. The study mentions nurses fear looking stupid in front of medical colleagues or facing dismissive behavior from doctors.
Well, that's a professional confidence issue, not a policy issue. If you're confident in your assessment, looking stupid shouldn't matter.
It matters when your evaluation depends on the respect of your peers. Culture affects escalation more than policy. If a telemetry tech calls an RRT because a lead comes loose and looks like VTAC, and they get yelled at by a sleep-deprived resident for wasting resources, what happens the next time? They hesitate, they second-guess, they wait for the nurse. And in that gap of hesitation, which you call failure to report, the patient dies. The blame culture you dismiss is the very thing causing the silence you condemn.
That is an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. You're suggesting that the emotional volatility of the workplace is the barrier. I would suggest that the solution to fear is removing the emotional decision-making process entirely. Through objective data, we need to look at the Modified Early Warning Score, or MUSE, discussed in the Cornerstone study.
You want to automate the trigger?
Line checks even when deterioration was evident? Nearly 5 hours, 291 minutes. That is inexcusable.
That is a long time in a hospital bed. A lot can happen in 5 hours.
It's an eternity. So the argument is that if we implement automated triggers where a score greater than 3 equals an automatic call, we protect the staff from blame. It's not being, I think the patient looks bad, or I don't want to bother the doctor. It becomes, the score says 4, protocol dictates, I call. It's not insubordination, it's math. You remove the overstepping accusation because the machine made the call.
I come at it from a different way. Automation sounds like a magic bullet, but it ignores the concept of alarm fatigue and the messiness of real-world data. The PMC study on rapid response teams points out that respiratory rate is the most sensitive marker for deterioration. It is also the least accurately recorded vital sign.
Right, because it's often estimated rather than counted. We've all seen respiratory rate 18 charted on a patient who is clearly breathing faster.
Exactly. So your automated score is based on bad data. Or consider the telemetry technician. You ask how we protect them from blame culture. They're staring at screens, not patients. If they call for a jagged waveform that looks like ventricular tachycardia, but it turns out the patient is just vigorously brushing their teeth, which creates a massive artifact, they lose credibility.
Toothbrush tachycardia.
Right. If you automate that, you have RRT teams running to rooms for toothbrushing incidents 10 times a day. The team gets fatigued, they start slow walking the response, they roll their eyes at the tech, and then when the real VFib hits, nobody runs. You cannot automate away the need for clinical judgment, and clinical judgment requires psychological safety.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because it assumes we can't distinguish between artifact and rhythm. But I do agree that we need to bridge the gap between the data on the screen and the reality in the room.
And that requires empowerment, not just better software. I want to introduce the Parkland Health study because I think it is the strongest evidence we have for my side of the table.
This was the bundled intervention study?
Yes. They did something radical. They didn't just tell techs to watch closer. They gave telemetry technicians a hotline to nurses. But more crucially, they empower techs to directly activate the IHECA, the code response, bypassing the primary nurse if necessary.
That is a significant bypass of the chain of command. That is giving the tech the keys to the siren.
It is. And the results? A 74% reduced risk of death during a code. Survival for VTVFRS, the shockable rhythms, went from 50% to 100% in the study period.
100%?
100%. When you give techs the authority to match their responsibility, they stop fearing the unnecessary call. They stopped worrying about the nurse being busy or the doctor being grumpy. They saw the rhythm, they hit the button, and they saved a life. Empowerment is the antidote to fear. When you officially sanction their ability to call, you remove the fear of overreacting.
That is a compelling argument, but have you considered the execution risks? I agree the Parkland data is impressive, but the Nashville VA report noted that rapid response team policy and staff practice did not always align. If you empower everyone to call, you must ensure competence.
Competence is always required, yes.
But look at Vibra again. The pages were sent, the alarms were loud, the staff simply ignored them. No amount of empowerment helps if the staff has checked out or normalized the noise. You can give a tech a button, but if they are desensitized to the alarm, they won't push it.
That's fair. There is a gap between the signal and the action.
And this is where we have to be practical. In those high-stress moments of uncertainty, is this VFib or is it a toothbrush? Is this patient crashing or is the lead loose? Staff need support to make that call. This episode is brought to you by Whole Life Healthcare, who produced the EKG Survival Pack.
A very relevant tool for this discussion.
Absolutely. It is designed for exactly this moment. It helps telemetry techs and RNs protect themselves when they're not sure what incident needs to be escalated to the rapid response team. It helps bridge that gap between uncertainty and action, giving you the confidence to distinguish the artifact from the arrhythmia.
Tools that build confidence are certainly part of the solution. If you know what you are looking at, you are less afraid of the resident yelling at you. But we have to talk about who pays the price when things go wrong. We talked about the double bind. Let's talk about the hierarchy of blame.
I want to return to the legal reality I mentioned at the start. In the Vibre case, we aren't just talking about a tech getting written up. The Director of Quality Management and the Chief Clinical Officer had to report the staff to licensing boards.
It went all the way to the top.
It did. The blame for calling too early is usually a grumble in the break room. Maybe a resident rolls their eyes. The blame for calling too late is a subpoena, a deposition, and the loss of your livelihood. That is why I reiterate, clinicians never get in trouble for calling too early, only too late. The law does not care about your hospital's toxic culture. It cares about the standard of care.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that it's that black and white. You're looking at the catastrophic end state. I'm looking at the daily grind that wears people down. In the Nashville VA case, the OIG found something very interesting that had nothing to do with heart rhythms.
The equipment issue?
Yes, they found improper RME practices, specifically dirty telemetry boxes being stored in clean supply areas.
Which is a violation of infection control.
It is, but think about what that finding represents. When the OIG comes in to investigate why patients aren't being monitored correctly, they find a way to blame the staff for dirty boxes. It shows how easily the system can turn on the lower-level staff for process failures to deflect from larger structural issues. If I'm a tech and I see the system willing to write me up for a dirty box or for wasting resources, I am going to be very careful about sticking my neck out.
But that's a deflection. Dirty boxes didn't kill the patient at Vibra. Ignoring the alarm did.
But the culture that nitpicks the small stuff while ignoring the structural barriers, like nurses being too understaffed to answer the phone, is the same culture. The Nashville VA eventually updated their policy to match the practice, effectively admitting the techs were right to call. But until that policy changed, those techs were vulnerable. They were doing the right thing, but they were doing it in the dark.
So where does that leave us? We have the Parkland data showing empowerment works. We have the Vibra data showing silence kills.
I think it leaves us with the conclusion that while patient safety is paramount, we cannot ignore the human element. Policies have to reflect the actual workflow. The Nashville VA eventually had to rewrite their policy to say, okay, the techs can call, because that's what was happening in reality. Empowerment, as we saw in the Parkland study, saves more lives than fear ever will. You have to give people the keys if you want them to drive the car.
And I would argue that while culture matters, the baseline must be strict adherence to escalation protocols. The Viber Hospital case is the cautionary tale that trumps any social awkwardness. When in doubt, follow the hospital's escalation protocol, which varies between systems, but always err on the side of the alarm. If you are a tech or a nurse listening to this, and you are staring at a funny rhythm, make the call. Let them roll their eyes. You will sleep better knowing you didn't ignore patient 1.
That is a fair point. The fear factor is real, but the data suggests that structured empowerment, like the Parkland model, is the way out of the double bind.
We encourage all our listeners to check their own hospital-specific escalation protocols today. It varies between healthcare systems and patient floors. Don't wait until the alarm goes off to know who you are allowed to call.
And remember, you can find the show and the source notes on Spotify by clicking the link below.
Thank you for joining the debate.